Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of History at High Noon, Emerging Revolutionary War. My name is Stacey and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. If you enjoy today's program, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at ncmuseumofhistory.org, where you can learn more about upcoming programs, exhibits, and digital resources. This is also where you can find more information about shopping at our wonderful museum shop and joining our North Carolina Museum of History Associates. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which in addition to many other things, helps make programming like today's program possible. A few quick housekeeping items for today. We ask that you please keep your mics muted and to type any questions that you have for our guest speakers into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, I will ask our speakers as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome today's speakers, Rob Orison, Division Manager for Prince William County Office of Historic Preservation and co-founder of Emerging Revolutionary War series, and Mark Malloy, historian for George Washington Memorial Parkway, National Park Service, and author of inaugural volumes in the Emerging Revolutionary War series. Rob, I believe that you are going to start us off, so I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Stacey, and thank you all for having us here today at the North Carolina Museum of History. It's a great facility for those who are watching from afar. I highly recommend you visit this museum. Great stories, great exhibits, great programs, obviously. So my task is this afternoon is to kind of talk a little bit about what Emerging Revolutionary War is. Back in 2017, myself, Phil Greenwalt, and a few other friends who are public historians created a blog series focused on the early American history, French Indian War, American Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812. We all have full-time jobs, and this is something we do that's a passion of ours. So we kind of do it on the side when we have free time, and it's kind of grown into many different facets beyond a blog. But the core of it is public historians sharing history about the early American period and making that accessible to the public. That's one of our keys, is to try to make this history as accessible to a broad audience as possible. The term emerging is something that's always been debated about what does that really mean. Our sister organization, which is called Emerging Civil War, is very similar to us, but deals with the topic of the American Civil War. But that emerging topic is not just us helping to promote emerging scholars, new historians, younger historians. Doesn't have to be young, because you can be getting into the history field at an older age, but trying to promote people the ability to share their research, share their passion of history. And the term emerging can also work with the fact that we're trying to reach new audiences. The common person out there who may have a slight interest in history, but is kind of maybe, a little bit intimidated by a 600-page book. So we like to be the gateway into that, into a deeper knowledge of the topic and getting people to the sites. And as we go through a few slides here, talk about what we do. So as I said at the beginning, we got started off with the blog, Emerging Revolutionary War, air.com. And on that blog, we have different facets of our site. We talk about different topics. We try to focus again on new research, promoting research to younger historians, new people getting into the field, but also promoting historic sites and museums like the museum we're sitting in today, to try to encourage people to get out into the field to actually stand where history stood. And so our blog pushes people in that direction. One of the things we started to do on April 19th of 2020, on the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, we launched what we call a Rev War Revelry. Now, this kind of started off as kind of a happy hour for us to get together, because during that time of COVID, we weren't seeing each other very much. And it was a way for us to get together, maybe have a drink on camera, and talk about different history topics in the early American Revolutionary period. And it has evolved. We have kept going with it, and we do it every other weekend, every other Sunday night at 7 o'clock. We invite on historians, authors, museum professionals, anyone that's an expert in a different topic. We cover French Indian War, American Revolutionary War, War of 1812, civilians, Continental, British, Loyalists, all different types of people that were involved in this very important time period of American history. So that's been something fun that we do. And it's also a way that we can really push out as much as we can to people that maybe can't attend something in person. So when we did the revelries, we decided, it'd be really great to kind of capture these things. And I know the museum here does this and turn some of these virtual presentations into online content that can stay there forever. So we have a YouTube page, as you see there on the screen. We also turn our videos into podcasts. So most of our presentations don't have slides or a lot of visuals with them. So they're great podcasts. So we created a podcast. So we just turn those audio presentations from Sunday nights into these podcasts. So you can listen to them in your car. Our historians have been recently featured on a lot of different documentaries. C-SPAN, we're on C-SPAN a lot. We've done some recent documentaries with Fox Nation, some other online content. And we provide, different insights into some of these historic events that took place in the revolution. Again, we try to focus on that public history side where we're trying to make it as open and accessible as many people as possible. A couple of years ago, working with our friends with the City of Alexandria, the Office of Historic Alexandria, we kicked off an annual symposium. We started that in 2019. Took a break in 2020 for obvious reasons. Last year, we were virtual with our symposium. This year, we will be in person in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., where most of our members, most of our historians are located in that Washington, D.C. area. So we do this annually. We bring in 5 different speakers and talk about different topics. This year, we're kind of talking about how the American Revolution impacted on an international stage. So many people don't know the lasting impacts of what happened here in the colonies in 1776 to 1781, 83, how that impacted France, how it impacted Russia, how it impacted things in Europe. So we like to make those connections and also try to make those connections to events that could be happening today. We're only talking 250 years ago. It's not that long in the history of the world. And a lot of the things that happened then still play a role in today. And then last year, this is where we really have our passion. And most of us, like I said, work at historic sites and museums. We love giving tours. We love doing interpretation to the public. That's what we do this for. And so last year we kicked off one of our annual bus tour series. Last year, we covered the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton up there in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. We had a full bus, which we're very excited about. We're very nervous about doing a bus tour coming out of COVID, how comfortable people would be doing an in-person tour. But as you can see in the slide here, we had a full bus, even had George Washington join us. Not sure where he came from. He just showed up. If you go to Washington's Crossing, Pennsylvania, George Washington just happens to show up. But it was a 2-day tour. It was a great tour, and we went ahead and decided to do another one, and we're doing that this November. And we're covering Valley Forge, which most people watching probably have heard of Valley Forge, and then talk about the Battle of Monmouth. And the reason why this period we think is important in American history is not just because we have 2 books that just came out about that, which is important to us, obviously, but also this is when the American Army is considered becoming into a professional fighting force. Valley Forge, Baron von Steuben professionalizes, and many others professionalize the American Army, train these men, men from North Carolina are up there in Valley Forge, and train them into how to be a professional fighting force. And then a few months later, in one of the hottest battles ever in American history, the Battle of Monmouth takes place there in June. And even though it's kind of a stalemate, the Americans fight really hard to the point that the British even comment very often about how the American Army has seemed to have changed fighting in the field. So that's coming up in November. And we also have a book series. You can see we have our 4 book titles here. We have a new book coming out, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Again, these books serve as entryways into these topics. So each book has a tour guide, again, with our focus on getting our reader to the sites, stand in the place where history happened. And we think that's very important to understand history, is to go to where it happened. Also, we're very big on preservation. We believe preservation is very important, preservation and conservation of these natural places, these cultural places that have a lot of natural resources as well, very important to preserve them. And by getting you to go attend these places and visit these places, we think that you'll become one of those people that go out and help preserve these places. So, and Mark has already moved my slide up to his book, which is our next book coming out in the series, To the Last Extremity. Hopefully it will be out soon. Hopefully this fall, that's our goal. And this book is about the siege of Charleston, not just the first siege. There are actually two different actions there in Charleston. And this book is going to print very soon. And Mark's presentation today is about the North Carolina soldiers that actually went from Morristown, New Jersey, and marched down to Charleston, South Carolina, that took a very active role in what happened in Charleston. So we thought there'd be a great place to share a little bit about Mark's research, a little bit about Mark's book, and tie it into the North Carolina story. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you again for having us on here to speak at the North Carolina State Museum. It's a real honor. This is, as Rob was saying, my name is Mark Malloy. I'm one of the historians with Emerging Revolutionary War. I have one book out with them right now, Victory or Death, which is about the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which and again, like Rob was saying, these are kind of introductory texts. They also have tour guides in it. And I'm originally from Virginia, born and raised there, and went to college there. And after college, I fell in love with the city of Charleston, South Carolina. If any of you have ever been there, it's a beautiful city. There's a ton of history from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. Lots of preserved buildings, and it's just a great place to learn about history. And I lived down there for a few years. And while I was there, I was amazed to find out, I'd heard the story about the 1776 battle that happened that gave rise to the Palmetto flag. If you've ever seen the South Carolina state flag, it's based off of this battle that happened in June of 1776. And that was kind of widely celebrated throughout Charleston. But then I found out about the 1780 siege that happened, which was a bigger action that wasn't really commemorated in any way. While I was down there, I worked with some of the folks down there to put up a state historic marker to denote location, because it was actually the largest surrender, the biggest defeat that the Americans had during the entire Revolutionary War. And I was just kind of amazed that it wasn't really commemorated or remembered very much on the ground. And so over the years, I moved back up to Virginia. So I'm up in Virginia now. But I've researched this more and more, and decided that when I wanted to write my next book, that I would focus on Charleston, South Carolina during the Revolutionary War, because there's so many stories down there, and then also what sites you can still see. Even if they're marked, sometimes they're not. So that led me to writing To the Last Extremity, which, like Rob said, should be coming out later this year. But as I was doing this research, and as we started talking about North Carolina history, I came across this amazing story about North Carolina Continentals that happened in 1780 during this siege. I just thought it was a fascinating story. So when we had the opportunity to come talk here, I thought this would be a great story to tell about James Hogan, General James Hogan, and the North Carolina Brigade during the siege of Charleston. So I'm going to give you a little bit background on this. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then afterwards be happy to answer any of your questions. But the story, really starts as Rob was talking about up there in New Jersey in 1778, when France enters the American Revolution on the side of the Patriots. It kind of changes the entire viewpoint of the war from the British standpoint. This was no longer the British trying to put down kind of internal rebellion of its colonies. It was now a global war. They had to worry about their colonies all around the world and the homeland. So it's going to change their strategy as far as where they need to focus their attention. They had captured the American capital in Philadelphia. But in 1778, they leave the capital. They go back to New York under the command of General Henry Clinton. In 1778, they fight the Battle of Monmouth, which, yes, if you want to actually be there on the ground with us, buy a ticket to one of our bus tours, because we only have a few spots left, but it's a great battlefield. But after the Battle of Monmouth, that's kind of the last major battle that occurred in the northern theater of the war. And then everybody's eyes kind of shift southward, and that's where we're going to be focused as well. What happens in 1779 is there's a small British force down in Savannah, Georgia, that they had captured Savannah, Georgia in 1778. And in 1779, a small British force of only a couple thousand soldiers, they actually march up into South Carolina and threaten the Carolina capital there in Charleston. Just this few thousand guys actually cut all the way up, get right up to the city gates, and then before falling back. It was a real kind of eye opener of how lightly guarded Charleston and the Southern Continental Army. There's only a few hundred guys at one point in the Southern Continental Army, so it was a small affair. But these 2,000 British soldiers under Prevost, they come up, they attack Charleston, they come back down to Savannah, and what happens is the commander of the Americans down in Charleston was General Benjamin Lincoln. And he's going to take his soldiers and march them down to Savannah. And there's a French fleet coming up from the Caribbean under Admiral D'Estaing. And they decide they're going to try and attack the British that were holed up there in Savannah. And that leads to the image you see here, which was just an utter disaster. And what happens is the French and the Americans lay siege. In order to try and break the siege, they do this massive assault in October 1779. Where it's just an utter disaster. Over 800 French and American troops are just mowed down as they assault the Spring Hill Redoubt, as you see here, including some of the finest soldiers from North Carolina and South Carolina as well. And it's just an utter disaster. They break the siege. D'Estaing has to go back to the Caribbean. What's left of Lincoln's army goes back up to Charleston. And at that moment, the commander of the main British Army in America, Henry Clinton, up in New York, he sees this as the opportunity that he thought it was one of the greatest events of the war, that here we have an opportunity to move south. And so meanwhile, at that same time, that winter, 1779, 1780, you have the worst winter of the entire war come through. And it gets so cold that winter that by January, the entire New York harbor actually freezes over, that soldiers are able to walk from Manhattan Island over to Staten Island. That's how deep the freeze was. There are multiple blizzards. There's multiple snowstorms. Everybody's writings were that this was the worst winter of the entire war. And despite all of this, it's usually forgotten, but most of Washington's army goes into an encampment in Morristown, New Jersey. And that's the image you see here, is just some of the soldiers trying to stay warm at Morristown. Most people remember Valley Forge, which wasn't as cold as Morristown or as snowy, but that was because more men died of disease. Less men died during the Morristown encampment, but it was just an awful winter. But just before the harbor freezed over, Henry Clinton is going to get out of New York. And he's going to head south. So you see on the map there where the British are up in New York, because now that the French fleet has been defeated and they're down in the Caribbean, the waters are open. And so what he's going to do is he's going to take a massive army of 10,000 soldiers, and they're going to sail down the coast. And as you see, they go all the way down to Savannah, and they get down to Savannah in the early months of 1780. And in February of 1780, he's going to move his massive army to go attack Charleston. Now, Clinton had bad memories of Charleston. He was part of the expedition that went against Charleston in 1776, years earlier. And what happened was they tried to engage the Americans at this fort called on Sullivan's Island, just outside the city. And what happened is it just got into a fighting match with the Navy in this fort, and the Navy ended up losing, and so they fell back. Now, Clinton didn't want to repeat those mistakes, so what he's going to do, he's going to end up landing south of Charleston and doing this overland march to try and capture Benjamin Lincoln. And Benjamin Lincoln only has about 2,400 soldiers in Charleston in February 1780. So he is desperate for soldiers. But luckily, some North Carolinians are on their way to try and save the day. Now, this is where this story, like I said, is pretty amazing. With Washington up in Morristown is a brigade of North Carolina Continental soldiers, over 1,000 of them. And these Continentals are some of the best soldiers in Washington's army. And what he's going to do is, Congress tells him to do this, is to dispatch some the North Carolina Continental regiments to go south to try and help Benjamin Lincoln. But you see, they don't control the seas. So these guys are going to have to march overland from Morristown all the way down to Charleston, South Carolina. That's almost 800 miles of ground to cover. And they actually leave in November of 1779. So throughout this bitter cold, awful winter, these guys are walking all the way down, through Pennsylvania. They get to Philadelphia, and they were hoping to try and get some boats, but they realize that they can't go use the water. So they're gonna have to go through Maryland, Virginia, their home state of North Carolina, and then down into South Carolina, try and save the day. So they start marching in November, and they march all the way throughout. By February, they actually are going to get to Wilmington, North Carolina. And you can imagine, it was dangerous going through their home state because there's a real desire to desert at that point. You can imagine marching past your home, you're marching 800 miles and then having to keep going to fight in a battle. So there's fear that there's going to be mass desertions of people. And just to clarify, just to understand, I mentioned these are North Carolina Continental soldiers. So there are a couple different types of soldiers, but you basically had Continentals and you had militia. Now the militia were kind of volunteer troops that would come up at a moment's notice. They usually weren't paid, and they would just come out to help out with a battle or for a short time, usually just a couple months, and then they would go back home. All the general officers in the Continental Army really disliked relying too much on militia soldiers because they generally weren't, as good soldiers as professional soldiers. They often broke and ran, and they weren't as reliable as the Continentals. Now, the Continentals were actually paid professional soldiers, and I say professional, but they signed up for a tour of duty to, whether it was a year, 3 years, and they were paid, and then they would have to stay with the Army throughout that entire period. And these guys were the ones that had to sit through these kinds of winter encampments. And this brigade under James Hogan, these were all Continentals that were going down. And their service often, is overlooked because we kind of celebrate the militia, jumping into the fray at a moment's notice. But the guys who stuck it out, if there wasn't a Continental Army together as a symbol of resistance throughout that war, the whole war would have fizzled out. So they were the real deal. And James Hogan is a fascinating character. I wish we knew more about him. Unfortunately, many of his papers and stuff were burned during the Civil War, so we don't have that much information, but we do know he was an Irishman, came from Ireland and settled here in North Carolina. He was an older gentleman, and his plantation was here in Halifax County. And I think it's the only marker for him is there's a state historic marker near where his plantation once was. But he's going to be commanding these soldiers trying to get down, and you can imagine how difficult it is trying to get these guys to keep going. And that led to a really interesting situation in 1780. This is an image from the French Revolution, but it kind of gives you a hint of what it might have looked like. In 1780, when these North Carolinians march all the way down to get to Wilmington, like I said, they're paid soldiers, but Continental Congress didn't have money at the time. And a lot of these guys weren't paid. And you can imagine how difficult that is. With they're sacrificing out there and they're not getting paid, and it was starting to rankle the troops very much. And there was a sergeant, Sergeant Samuel Glover, who was a veteran of many of the battles at Germantown and Brandywine and Monmouth, and he had done his duty. And he said when they got to Wilmington that him and some of the other men started talking, and they said they're not going to march anymore until they get paid. Well, they weren't going to have any of that, so he was immediately executed for trying to start a mutiny. And after he was executed in Wilmington, then they continued their march down to Charleston. As they get down to Charleston, these are a couple maps that are going to be in the new publication, so you're getting a sneak peek of what these maps look like. The image on your right is a map of kind of Clinton's invasion in 1780. Now, like I said, before that, he's going to land his troops south of the city, and you can see the dates there as he makes his way up throughout February. Lincoln, like I said, is downtown Charleston, and he really can't do anything to stop this. He doesn't have enough men. Like I said, he only got 2,400 guys, and he's deciding whether he's going to try and protect the city or if they should, kind of run and try and fight another day. Well, Lincoln's getting some pressure from the Continental Congress, but also the city of Charleston, that he needs to make a stand and try and stop them from getting from the British from capturing, the biggest port town in the South, Charleston. So, and if they can fortify, he gets word that the North Carolinians are, by February 1780, they're in Wilmington, so they're close by. If he can hold out till reinforcements get there, they might be able to repulse any sort of assault, just like the British did at Savannah. They were able to repulse this assault on their lines. Maybe the same thing could be happening here at Charleston. But so they literally just kind of sit there in Charleston and watch this massive army that's 3 times their size work their way up to the city of Charleston. Nothing much they can do, but they do start building fortifications. And that's what you see on the left side of your screen. That's kind of a view of downtown Charleston, of all the earthworks that start being built. And he's going to build this extensive line of earthworks to try and put up a defense of the city. By March, it was on March 3rd when 750 out of the about 1,000 guys that left Morristown, about 750 North Carolinians under Hogan march into Charleston. And Lincoln said it was to great huzzas, and it really helped the spirit and the confidence of the men there, that here were some battle-hardened Continentals coming in to help defend the city of Charleston, and gave great spirit to the men. And they immediately go right into the lines to help defend the city. So that bolsters, there's also some militia that join up as well. So it bolsters Lincoln's men up to about 4,800 men. So now he's got more of an army, almost half the size of the British coming, that he's going to try and help defend the city of Charleston. By March, but the British are come down in early April, and that's when they first start digging these their own earthworks, and they're going to lay siege to the city of Charleston. This is going to be a long siege. It's going to be a 42-day siege of the city of Charleston, and you're going to have this kind of like no man's land between the American and British lines as they fire at each other and try and force the Lincoln and his men to give up. Well, after the North Carolinians made this harrowing march all the way down here, Washington's going to also dispatch the entire Virginia line to basically follow the North Carolinians in the same path to get down here to also help bolster their forces. And it's not until early April, on April 7th, 750 Virginians arrive just in time. They get right into the lines. And again, it was another big boost to confidence of the Continentals in there. And so now they think they can actually hold out this town. But the British start inching closer and closer and closer, and they start closing off any sorts of retreat points. The British Navy eventually gets into the harbor. There was only a small American Navy there under Abraham Whipple that can't really do anything, and they fall back, and everything's kind of closing in on Charleston. And Lincoln at one point has an opportunity. He can just evacuate all his guys out, one of the last attempts to try and get out of the city. But the city leaders actually say, no, you can't leave us here. And if you try and leave, we'll open the city gates and we'll let the British in here. So now he's facing, the fact that, even the civilians that he's trying to defend here are almost going to turn on him. And it's looking really bad for the Americans. And then eventually the militia also start giving up on this cause. The Americans are losing supplies, they're starving, and it's just too large of a force. And after the Virginians come, there's no more reinforcements coming to save them. And the British are kind of tightening the noose on them. And this is a great image, from the 19th century, Alonzo Chapel of the British there. You can see digging their things, and you can see downtown Charleston there. And they're firing back and forth. And as the British move closer and closer and closer, Clinton's trying to get them to surrender so he doesn't have to try and do an assault. Many of the defenders are hoping there's going to be an assault so they can actually have a chance at stopping them. But as their supplies run out, they're really running out of options. And then Lincoln basically understands that he's going to have to surrender. So what he's going to do is he's going to try and negotiate some kind of surrender that lets his army out. The British think, that's preposterous. They want a totally, fully unconditional surrender of the entire garrison. And between negotiations, eventually, on May 12th, 1780, Benjamin Lincoln's going to surrender to the British. And here you can see an image. This is right downtown Charleston on King Street, right there in Marion Square. If you've ever been there, it's, like I said, I love Charleston. It's a great city, tons of history, but it's also lots of bars, restaurants, all sorts of fun things to do down there. And this area in particular is all sorts of, all sorts of things to do. And I always wondered, how many people, are walking down here having a good time, not realizing that they're actually walking on a Revolutionary War battlefield where men fought and died. And it ends up being, like I said, the biggest surrender of the entire war. The Americans, Lincoln ends up surrendering over 5,000 Continentals and militia to the British. A bigger, there's not going to be a bigger American army to surrender to a foreign army until World War II at Bataan. So this was a huge deal, and it was the entire continental line down there. So all the North Carolinians, all the Virginians, those lines ceased to exist, and so they're going to have to start recruiting new soldiers in their hometowns, which is just it's hard to overstate the massiveness of this defeat. The British have them march out right in this area where Marion Square is today. They lay down their arms, and originally, they were going to keep the Continentals imprisoned in the city. But eventually, as the war continues to progress, and this was a big capture for the British. The British are going to take over the city. Over the course of this entire siege that happened in 1780, both sides are going to lose about 250 men killed, wounded, and captured. But actually, the biggest loss of life was just 2 days after they capture all these guys. They're throwing all their muskets into an armory. The British are, and somebody was careless. They threw a musket in there. It went off, and the entire armory went up. And over 200 people were killed immediately by this massive blast. And that's a site in the book that you can actually go stand where that took place, but there's no markers, nothing that commemorates that today. So it's kind of interesting history, but a lot of people don't realize that, how many people died during this awful explosion that happened right after. But Lincoln and these guys are really humiliated during this surrender. They're not allowed to, have their flags flying. And like I said, and they're all kept as POWs. And the British were hoping to try and get some sort of exchange going with the Americans. They were hoping to get some of their captured guys back. But what happens is unfortunately, a lot of the officers, they're going to separate the officers from the privates. And they're actually going to try and recruit from the privates, get them to join the British Army and go fight in other theaters of war. But the Americans, like I said, originally in the city, but what's going to happen is they run out of space and they end up putting them all out on prison ships in Charleston Harbor. And at least the privates are. And this is, I think, one of the most tragic stories is these guys are put on these prison ships, thousands of them in Charleston Harbor. And the conditions on these prison ships are just awful. Men were dying of disease, malnutrition, all these kinds of things. And like I said, the dead bodies were often tossed overboard. They had been doing this process up in New York Harbor for years. And probably the most infamous that's drawn here is the HMS HMS Jersey, which is an infamous ship of hundreds of people dying on this ship. In New York, their bones were actually still being washed ashore into the 19th century, and they eventually gathered up many of the remains. And there's a large monument in Brooklyn to the prison ship martyrs of the American War of Independence. But down in Charleston, there are also hundreds of men that are dying down there. Unfortunately, there's no marker for them and all those guys that died out there. And these men, like I said, I mean, they're real heroes when you think about it, that British officers are coming down there, giving them a way out. They took the King's shilling and they joined up with the British Army. that was their ticket out of these awful conditions. And some of them do take that, but the ones who don't must have had, what is keeping them from doing that? And, it must have been a true belief in the principles for which they are fighting for. And a perfect example of this was none other than General James Hogan. He was an officer, so he was stationed at Hadrill's Point, which is just across the Cooper River from downtown Charleston. There you can see on the left side kind of a view of what it would have looked like around that time, where they would have been kept in quarters there. And today, the only thing is a marker, a state historic marker there you see in Mount Pleasant, just across from Charleston. And Hogan, the officers, like I said, they kind of gave usually special treatment to, but Hogan was given an option to try and get out of being at Hadrill's Point, but he refused. He wanted to stay there with his other officers. Unfortunately, he gets sick, and on January 4th, 1781, he dies of disease at Hadrill's Point, and is buried in an unmarked grave somewhere over there. Nobody knows where his remains are today. Him, along with hundreds of his fellow North Carolinians who perished on the prison ships out in Charleston Harbor. But that was the end of James Hogan and his North Carolina Brigade. Like I said, a truly tragic story, but pretty amazing that the feat they accomplished. And this is a great view of downtown Charleston. If you haven't been, I definitely recommend a visit to Charleston. And the book that I'll be coming out with is going, like I said, it's going to detail in more depth, but not, it's only going to be like 100 pages. So it's got lots of photographs and lots of maps to kind of illustrate it for you. But hopefully it gives you an introduction to this topic, because there are some great books over the years that have been written about Charleston during the Revolutionary War. But this kind of is an entry level for anybody who's interested in it. But Charleston, to the last extremity, is going to talk about all of this. It's going to include maps, and it includes a tour guide. So it's going to tell you the GPS coordinates of where all these things are. It's going to let you be able to go down there to Charleston on your next vacation down there and be able to see all the Revolutionary War sites, to stand, where these people stood. And I'll finish up, and I'll be happy to answer questions after this. But like I said, when I was doing the research and I found out the story of, and originally my first introduction was the Virginians, who did the similar march right after the North Carolinians. But both these brigades of Continentals marching 800 miles, going down to the city of Charleston to defend this town that none of them were from, but because it was their devotion to duty to do this. And they go down there and they're there for a few weeks, and then they get captured, and then they have to suffer on the prison ships. I just thought it was an amazing story. And I found this great quote from Judge William Clark, who is a North Carolina Supreme Court judge. And he had this great history about James Hogan, what little we know about him and his men. But when writing about it, this is at around the turn of the century, in the late 18th, early 19th century, he wrote that of James Hogan and his part in history, he said, in this march they did in 1780, he said, history affords no more striking incident of devotion to duty. And North Carolina should erect a tablet to his memory, and that of those who perished there with him. And I think that's just a great way to close it. There's still work to be done to find out more about these men's stories, and to find a way to still memorialize them and remember them as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. There's no better time to find these stories, to remember these men, remember these sacrifices that were made, so that we have our country we have today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over I'm going to go ahead and join my colleague Rob over here. So I'll stop sharing this, and then be happy to try and answer any of your questions you all might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Mark, for this awesome presentation. We do have some questions from the chat, so let me pull that up. I'm going to ask you those. So the first question, questions for you, Rob, it's about the Emerging Revolutionary War project. Question about how you got started and if there's any possibility that the symposium might be a hybrid.
Yes, and thank you for that question. That's a great point. I'll cover the symposium first. That will be hybrid. There will be a hybrid option. And so if you go to the website, that should be on there. The City of Alexandria is doing a lot of hybrid presentations who we're partnering with on the symposium. So there is a price for in-person, and then there's a price for hybrid, so for virtual. So thanks for bringing that up. I failed to mention that earlier. As far as how the emerging project started, I have to give full credit to my good friend, Dr. Chris Mikowski with the Emerging Civil War. Him and some friends were working for the National Park Service at the time. They were getting out of the Park Service. They really wanted to keep doing public history with the Civil War and interpret Civil War topics to the public, and found that that was a great way to do that and to keep going, keep researching, and keep sharing these great stories. And then it turned into trying to give a voice to new historians, people that were, just coming out of college or just getting into the field. Like I said, it doesn't have to be an age thing. It could be someone who's older who gets into the history field later on. And so I have to give credit to the emerging Civil War people, because they recruited me to do some Civil War writing. And my friend, Phil Greenwald, who's not here today, who's another founder of our group, he and I were in the Civil War group, and we decided, hey, we like talking about the American Civil War, but we're really interested in early American history. And there's really not much there to get the public out to these sites. So we kind of shifted our attention from Civil War to the American Revolution. And like I said, we also do War of 1812 and French Indian War. But so little is known about those two wars that we've kind of focused a lot on the American Revolution. But when we do get opportunities to talk about the French Indian War and talk about the War of 1812, we do that as much as we can too.
And I'll just add in too, I think it's a great opportunity. It's fun. We enjoy history. We love reading about it. I love reading, and then I like being able to tell people about stories. That's kind of why I got into public history and working at historic sites. But this gives us an opportunity to explore, to go places that our regular day jobs don't take us. So I think it's just a great way to explore some of these stories, learn more, and then be able to share that to other people. It's an awesome opportunity to constantly keep learning. We do these chats that he talks about on every other Sunday night with different historians, and we're constantly learning new things. So just keeping that constant learning going it's fun. So.
Okay, our next question is from Lorraine, and she asks, do we have resources that delineate the path the North Carolina Continentals took through North Carolina en route to South Carolina for encampments and et cetera?
That's a fantastic question. And I, through my limited research so far, I haven't found the exact path they took. I'm not sure what's there. I know, like I said, a lot of stuff has been lost through the Civil War and other thing, and things being lost. We have like a couple, the thing about Samuel Glover there in Wilmington, we know some of that stuff because we do have a couple letters from Hogan to George Washington. So there's some things that have been preserved. But as far as like an entire, we know they went through this area, taking these paths. I don't have that right now, but it'd be great. And I think that's a project worth looking into, but hopefully we'll be able to find out a little bit more, because I think that'd totally be worth, because, and another thing, there is a great Washington Rochambeau Trail the National Park Service has that does the exact same thing to mark the location of Washington's army going down to Yorktown. Of course, that ended in the great victory at the end of the war, Yorktown. Nobody focuses on, these ill-fated troops going to a defeat. And, I think that's something that's been overlooked that definitely should be worthwhile researching into. Great question.
Yeah, I would say too, pension records are so important when we do American Revolutionary War research. The war is not as well documented as the American Civil War, and there's lots of reasons for that. There's literacy, there's all kinds of access to the common person being able to write letters and send those letters to people, and keeping those letters. So there's a great resource called the pensions, where a lot of these veterans would apply for pensions later on, and they would document their service. Now you have to be careful with that, because sometimes, 50 years later, 30 years later, memory isn't great, and they like to elaborate sometimes on what they did. But it's a great place to start, is looking at those pension records. And we have some great friends that we work with that are documenting and putting online all the pension records for the soldiers that fought in the Southern campaign. So that's a great place to start.
Okay, our next question is from Charlie regarding the Continental POWs who had joined the British Army. Do you know what happened to any of them after the war?
That's a great question. I haven't delved that deep into it. There was a name for them, the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. And so, yeah, many of them do, and they end up going down to the Caribbean, because one of the things they were trying to do is say, hey, you're not gonna have to fight your brother, your cousin here in the Carolinas. We're going to send you to go fight the French down in the Caribbean. But what happened to them after the war? That's a great question. I don't know. There's massive reprisals to many of the loyalists, anybody who joined up. And that's one of the hallmarks of the war in the South, was just how bitterly divided it was between patriot and loyalist. And there were many reprisals to the loyalists. So I don't think many of them would have come home or been welcome home. But that's something I might have to look into. And there's also a great story. They weren't just trying to get the private soldiers; they were trying to get some of the officers. And one of the former royal governors of South Carolina actually reached out to General William Moultrie of South Carolina, one of the heroes of South Carolina, and was trying to get him to join up. He said, "Hey, you want to command one of these regiments?" And Moultrie was livid, and he immediately said, "There's no way." And it's even on his gravestone today, his response to Governor Montagu, where he says, "If I had any honor in my heart, I would never desert the cause in which I'm engaged in." So it's a great, little known story about the war. But good question. But yeah, I think I need to research that a little more.
I'd say too, some of these men that did stay in the area changed sides. You'll see a lot of these soldiers would change sides a lot. A lot of them would become partisans with Moultrie or Sumter or Pickens, other partisan groups that would, they change sides a lot. And that was a problem for both the British and the Americans, is to try to keep people to one side or the other. And like Mark said, the war in the South is very bloody, because it's really a civil war. You have communities, you have neighbors constantly fighting back and forth with each other. So it's a much different type of war down in the Southern campaign than it is up in the New England area or Mid-Atlantic.
Okay. Susie asks, did any of the soldiers keep diaries? Wondering if there are any firsthand accounts.
So yes, there were diaries. I think probably the most famous, well, there were diaries and there are also memoirs. I think one of the most famous memoirs was Joseph Plum Martin, who wrote a famous recounting of his time in the war. Although he spent most of his time, he was in a New England regiment, he spent most of his time in the northern part. In the southern parts, we do have some diaries and some letters. I would say one of the biggest resources, it's a published diary, was actually from the British side. He was a Jaeger. His name was Captain Johann Ewald. And he's going to keep a meticulous diary. He was also in the Northern Theater, but throughout the entire Southern Theater, he keeps a very detailed record of everything he sees and does. And that's publicly accessible. So that's actually been published. But I think there are some more, but not quite as many diaries, I think, as we have in the Civil War. Right. So I wish there was more, but a lot of them are after the war, whether it's memoirs or pension applications after the war are most of the things, but few diaries, and especially ones that have to do with, particular parts of the war. So.
Okay, our next question is from Ted, and they ask, when were the North Carolinians released and how many of the brigade survived?
So this is a great question. And actually, before this talk, I was trying to look at the numbers. And what happens is it's kind of constantly changing. Because what you have is, like I said, even on the march down, I was trying to determine how many actually deserted or how many left. But as different regiments enlistments expired, some of them would go home on the march. Some of them deserted. And then those that were captured and put on prison ships, like I said, at the actual surrender, there's about 750 North Carolinians who are captured at Charleston in 1780. But what happens is yes, there are other regiments raised, and there's militia and other things. And what happens is they end up fighting at places like Camden and other battles that are going to take place in the months that follow. Because what happens after Charleston's captured, General Charles Cornwallis is going to try and, tame the backcountry. And what happens is they end up getting more prisoners, and they end up sending those prisoners down to Charleston, and they end up throwing on the prison ships as well. And like I said, there was a whole debate as to, can we exchange these troops? They were actually hoping to try and get, some of the guys that were captured at Saratoga back in 1777. They were trying to get some sort of prisoner exchange, but every opportunity to try and do the exchange kind of fell through. And it's not until, I believe it's the summer of 1781 that they're actually going to start releasing some of the prisoners. And as far as how many North Carolinians actually get off, I believe the count, it's over 1,000 though, that end up combined from all these ones. I'm not sure. Actually, wait, about 1,000 of them I think are released. I know total in the harbor, Carl Borick, who wrote a great book just about the prisoners in Charleston called Relief of This Burden. He actually calculates about 800 men are going to die in Charleston Harbor. So I imagine, from North Carolina, I'd have to check the actual numbers, but I don't have them off the top of my head. It's a good question though.
Okay, this one is from Lee Holder, and they ask, is there a site that might help someone identify specific soldiers and volunteers that fought in Charleston? It would be helpful for teachers to make connections to their specific area of the state.
That's a great question. Site that can identify some of the specific soldiers. A lot of times, I don't think there's one specific site that actually can do that. There was returns made at the surrender where they actually, so they know the numbers, but as far as the specific names, I think I don't know if that exists yet. And usually what it is you find somebody through a pension application or something like that, saying that they served in the 1st North Carolina. And then, you look at the dates in which they served and, they surrendered at Charleston in 1780. That's usually how we kind of piece it together. But I don't think there is one site that kind of, that'd be great. Maybe that's a project, for the 250th.
Yeah,
Try and I know there are different, I think up in Valley Forge, actually, there's an attempt to try and document every single name in the regiments that are actually encamped there. I think there's, more work to be done on that. So.
Also from Ted, are you involved with the American Battlefield Trust, which is now preserving Revolutionary War battlefields?
Yes, very much so. We just did presentations for them at their annual conference up near DC a few months ago. Mark Leotor, Mount Vernon, and George Washington's Alexandria. And if you go on their website that deals with the American Revolution, you'll see a lot of their essays are authored by either myself or Mark or other emerging Revolutionary War historians. So very much involved with them. If you are into preservation, I would highly recommend you support American Battlefield Trust. It's one of the best nonprofits out there, well run, well managed, and do great work. So we do a lot of collaboration with them and trying to get the content on their website to be more accessible to the public and also help them with tours. We do a lot of walking tours with them and bus tours with them as well. So the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, they're a great organization. So we definitely support all the work they're doing to try and save battlefields all across the country.
Rob asks, what was Washington's strategy after the loss in Charleston?
Take New York City. That's a great question, but I would say Washington tended to focus on New York City a lot. I think when the Americans lose New York, it really bothered Washington. He was really run out of New York, not in a very honorable way, and the army disappeared as they were leaving New York and going through New Jersey on its way to Trenton. So I think as far as strategy goes, I simplified it by saying go after New York because it was a big goal for him. But I think what Washington was trying to do was at that point, the French were allies of the Americans, and so he really wanted to capitalize on that partnership. The French had a great navy. Americans did not. The French had money, though we would find out many years after the war that the money they were spending on us didn't really help their cause back home. But I think Washington, New York City, and also trying to capitalize on that powerful relationship between the American and French, and use the French Navy and the French Army and French resources to defeat the British.
Yeah, and I gotta say Washington is very much focused on the main theater up there in New York, and it's kind of amazing that he's willing to, he does part with sending reinforcements down here after the loss of Charleston. They're going to set up a new Southern Continental Army under Horatio Gates to come down and try and get patriots to join up and try and keep the war going. And one of Washington's greatest things is when he ends up making the move to not attack New York and to instead go to Yorktown, which of course is going to be the definitive battle that's going to be the last major land battle during the war. But throughout that time, that's the other thing too, a lot of people don't realize, is the British stayed in Charleston all the way until 1782. They didn't evacuate until the end of 1782. And that was a big celebration in Charleston. Was Evacuation Day that was always celebrated when they finally retook the city of Charleston. And they actually started doing some recent programs around that time in December to celebrate that, even to this day. And Washington does take a trip down to Charleston in 1791. He spends 10 days down there. And in an appendix of my book, I detail his entire trip, to 10-day tour of Charleston. So you can see everywhere Washington went. And today there's a great statue and painting to commemorate Washington's visit in 1791, where he goes and visits the siege lines to see where these men fought, and visits Fort Moultrie and visits all these sites in kind of a celebration of the new nation in 1791. So.
Last question. What was, and I'm going to butcher this, so I apologize, Banastre Tarleton's role in the Siege of Charleston?
That's great. So Tarleton, maybe you've ever seen the movie The Patriot. It's there's a fictionalized version of him, Tavington, that's portrayed by Jason.
That was going to come up today, wasn't it?
Tarleton, he's a cavalry officer, and he had fought in the Northern Theater. He's with Clinton's army, and he actually is in command. What he creates is called the British Legion, which is interestingly all Americans. They're loyalists that join up with him, and what happens is he ends up kind of sealing off the northern part. His cavalry goes around. The Americans had very few cavalry, and he kind of destroys what little cavalry the Americans had. There's some small actions at Lanud's Ferry, and there's also an action at Monk's Corner, and Tarleton's going to be involved at Lanud's Ferry, so he's there at the end of it. And there's actually a small contingent of Virginians who are still marching down to try and reinforce Charleston, and they're in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina, when they get the word that Charleston had surrendered. So they turn around and start heading back north. And Tarleton's guys go after them, and they catch up with these Virginians at a place called the Waxhaws. And at Waxhaws, there's Tarleton's guys ride into them, and they end up killing most of them. And it became known as the Waxhaws Massacre or Buford's Massacre. And that's a neat little site if you've never been down there. That's memorialized today. A sad subject, but also a reminder of the brutalness of this civil war that was going on in South Carolina during the Revolution. But yeah, he was there. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rob and Mark, for today and this wonderful in-depth look at the Revolutionary War and sharing Emerging Revolutionary War series with us. And thank you guys for joining us today. We hope to see you at our next program, History at High Noon, from Landfill Dogs to Stardust and Ashes, happening Wednesday, August 31st, noon, here at the museum. Take care. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.